نتابع استكمالا لأعمال جلسات مؤتمرنا الجلسة الثانية التي تحمل عنوان
We shall continue our conference, panel 2, Strategic Considerations of Fourth Generation Warfare, headed by Major General Ahmed Ali Hamid Al Ali, Commandant, Joint Command and Staff College, UAE. In the name of God Almighty, the most gracious, the most merciful, we shall carry on our conference, panel 2. Allow me to express my thanks for His Highness Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, for his patronage of this conference. This is an evidence for our leaders' interests to really talk about these issues. I would like to thank as well the ECSSR, hosting always all the conferences to give us all the solutions needed in these endeavors. We find the idea of the content and the strategy of the fourth generation warfare lie in the fact that it is a tool of destruction, whether old or new, which aims at instigating the ideological conflicts through the NGOs and the use of poverty, unemployment, religious extremism, Islamic currents, terrorist militias, armed terrorist militias. It is proxy wars and self-destructions and remote killing, which limits the direct use of the military force and organized military, and to achieve the targets with less human losses. It is important, which has its really work in this endeavor, the ICT and the social media networks. We have Major General Staff Pilot Hisham Al-Halabi. He's an advisor at the Nasser High Military Academy of Egypt. His Excellency Osama Haikal, Member of Parliament, the ENPC Chairman, the former Minister of Information, Arab Republic of Egypt. Major General, you have the floor. In the name of God Almighty, in the beginning, all the thanks and appreciation for the United Arab Emirates leaders and government and people for the kind invitation and for the invitation of the ECSSR. Would like also to thank Dr. Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi. It's a great honor to be here amongst you, amongst the Excellency, the Member of Parliament, Hassan Haikal. The non-conventional threats is posing a threat all over the world, and this vision has contributed, especially in the deterioration of the possibility of having a war. The traditional war is based on destroying its capability of waging a war through imposing its own identity, whereas the fourth generation warfare aim at avoiding military confrontation, direct military confrontation between the armies. And therefore, this terminology has emanated in addition to other generations, which are the fifth and the sixth generations. The fourth generation, the armed forces do not use it to achieve their objectives. It aims at destroying the armed forces and destroying the targeted countries from abroad. There are lots of challenges. The expansion of the war, which aims at the targeted country while focusing on achieving victory. This has a tool of ethics that plays a pivotal role. Also, the historical and ethnic issues that play a pivotal role. Militant non-state actors also use these powers, such as Hezbollah and Muslim Brotherhood, all those present in the region, the use of these tools in the psychological operations. There is a difference between a psychological war targeting the military during times of war, whereas the psychological operations aim at the civilians in times of war and peace. It doesn't really use the means of destroying all these wars. To confront these wars is through a different strategy that works on the fields of political, military, security, social, and economic. The suggested strategy to confront these wars, the main strategic objective is to confront the fourth generation warfare by avoiding its occurrence in the country, or to lessen its impact in case of its occurrence, to overcome it. This is the strategic objective, to put realistic objectives that can be overcome and great flexibility in planning. Precautionary or preemptive work is mandatory, and the strategy is being implemented at the same time, where the time frame is being defined to implement the strategy according to the possibilities and circumstances of each country. Points of strength and opportunities are being used as strategic foundations to overcome and face the points of weakness and the challenges and the threats that are considered important for this strategy. I shall be talking about two main points. What are the main aspects that we can depend on, and what are the definitions that we should overcome via these basics? The definitions of the strategy. One of the most important determinants is that this conflict is multifaceted and multi-levels, and it turns into the internal front. What is ever changing is that it is the smart force between its soft power and its strong power, which are mixed together. The strong power is built on imposition, whereas the soft power is a kind of soft aspect that instigate a number of questions and ambiguity. A great definition of the fourth generation warfare, in addition to the difficulty of understanding or the civilians understanding this, and proxy wars in all fields, not only military but in all fields. And we have seen, of course, the proxy war such as the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah. In addition to that, the emergence of the stronger powers and the psychological issues to really use the NGOs, local NGOs, as one of the centers through which we can infiltrate the country. Usually, they don't have a strategy to face, and therefore it is destroyed quickly. And we've seen similar things emanating on the ground. The internal definitions or determinants, as for the regional determinants, lack of stability, the use of the Arab revolutions to interfere in the internal affairs, and to play a regional role on behalf or at the expense of the other countries, and transport terrorism. All these are important. The regional or international determinants, the Western countries do not come to achieve the objects and the interests of the region, but its own interests, the diversity of interests, and the variety in the use of pressure on the country to impact the political will and the excessive activity for the international organizations in the country under different names and the difficulty to control the Western media outlets. As for the most important strategic foundations that can be used to overcome the previous determinants, the true understanding of the nature of the fourth generation warfare and the promptness in analyzing and understanding the changes in a scientific manner. This center has confronted this issue when it comes to understanding and analyzing in a scientific manner and a great historical background when the country really faced all these crises to bring about all these samples of history to work on really showcasing all these parties. We are talking here about the non-traditional threats and the support of the civil sectors, the military cooperation between the countries of the region, and to take use of the interests of the region as one of the main issues. As for the strategies suggested here, they are different and multifaceted. In the political, military, security aspects, societal, and economic, I shall talk promptly. But all these fields focusing on the three main ideas. The main objective in every field, the suggested policies, mechanisms of implementation who will be implementing this strategy. I start with the political field. I've divided it into two aspects. Foreign policy, to forbid these countries to interfere in the internal affairs and to coordinate with the regional forces and international forces, suggest policies to achieve these objectives, to lessen the international interferences in our countries, and to keep the international organizations to negatively use these issues or to mobilize the public opinion against the country, to coordinate regionally and to create balanced relations, to activate the Security Council, which is one of the mechanisms due to the Sharm el-Sheikh summit on the levels of the leaders, in addition to a committee of governors which works on solving these crises before it expands, and an Arab peace force. One of the mechanisms that has been discussed and emanated, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has gathered all the institutions, ad hoc institutions. That's for the internal policy to take heed of the civil societies and civil sector from being disintegrated. This is the objective of the fourth generation warfare, and to really immunize the society against these psychological operations, suggested policies, and to define the points of weakness in the civil sectors. The civil sectors should should be aware to identify the points of weaknesses, to guarantee and preserve the freedoms in the country, to really make all the internal forces to participate in the national actions and to face the psychological operations, to fight extremism, to activate the role of the crisis management centers or throughout the country. And we have the ministry, the cabinet, and all the ad hoc parties that should play a role to really preserve the unity of the armed forces in the country. This is important to help the civil sector in the country from being disintegrated. Suggested policies, preemptive operations is important to control the borders of the country, to take heed of the legal dimension upon the occurrence of fighting terrorism, to coordinate and cooperate internally and regionally and worldwide to help the civil sectors is important when it comes to the armed forces, especially the sectors that will affect negatively on the lives of the civilians on a daily basis. It coordinates with the Ministry of Interior and the institutions of the civil societies. This is important in the strategy. It aims at raising awareness constantly with different means of the fourth generation warfare in this regard. Due to the importance of this field, which I have divided into three main aspects. First of all, the cultural aspect, to develop the popular participation through active institutions that really bring about all the parties under one umbrella, to confront the extremism idea and mentality that should be really faced and confronted. To face this mentality, we are really fighting extremist and mentality in this endeavor in all the sectors needed to raise awareness when it comes to the principles of democracy and law, and to consecrate the understanding of volunteering in the civil society sectors. To have all the institutions, cultural institutions, in addition to the media outlets and the civil society organizations that should play a role in this endeavor. As to the media aspect, to lessen the use of the foreign and internal media outlets as an arm against the country, and to avoid mobilizing the public opinion, to use the internal media to raise awareness and to really fight all of these organizations and to disseminate the true analysis and the truth, and to raise the level and the proficiency of the media, and to consecrate the understanding of work, and to take heed of the military media. The old understanding was only the main objective is to really relay all the information to the military, but in the fourth generation warfare, our objective now is to relay all the information to all the civilians all over the place. This is new for the military media, and to create mechanisms of measurement for the public opinion. The Ministry of Information, in coordination with the Ministry of Defense and other media institutions and the civil society organizations, we should convince the NGOs, local NGOs, to play a very important role in facing the fourth generation warfare and implementing this strategy. As to the third aspect is the educational aspect, to raise awareness when it comes to the teachers and the students when it comes to the different kinds of these wars and the threats and challenges that the country is facing, and to relay loyalty and belonging to the nation and the spirit of really cooperation, coordination of to put a course within the methodology and the scholastic system that talks about allegiance and loyalty. We have been through a lot throughout the generations. There should be a certain course and a lesson that talks about the national security. This is important, and to train the teachers on the civil dialogue style, to respect the difference through training, not through slogans, because being different is normal. It is life. Everyone is different. No one should be the same. There are countries that have been disintegrated due to the expansion of conflicts amongst each other until it reached an armed conflict. To attract the teachers and the students away from the NGOs, and this is important. They are trying to attract them and to focus on the studying history, the history of the Arab countries and the honorable examples throughout history, to get these examples that give a force to the generation. Ministry of Education and Higher Education in all the countries. As to the economic field, which is the last field in the strategy, building a strong economy that can face the challenges of the fourth generation warfare, to lessen the impact of the economic difficulties that some of the societies are facing, and to take use of these people in really mobilizing them against the country. And this is one of their means, and this is wrong, to define the economic sectors that are the most affected and supporting it, to have a varied economy. Some of the fields get affected, such as touristic sector, and therefore the economy should not be built and based on one single field, such as tourism or economy, but it should be diversified, and we should depend on ourselves and have the national capital being invested in the country, and to encourage the foreign participation in the economy, which has a risk transfer, of course, and a risk diversification. justice policies to encourage the integration between small economic institutions that get affected, and to merge them together that lessen the negative impact and the shock on these institutions, and to limit the falling of these institutions, to create funds to face these crises, and to reconstruct these areas that have been affected by terrorism, so that they do not take advantage of those people who have suffered from this terrorism. Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, and other ad hoc ministries, Central Bank, the institutions of the NGOs, and local institutions. To implement this strategy and complete proficiency, we should focus on the following: to understand truly the changes of the wars, to confront it quickly. Being slow is not good. To coordinate in all fields, to really flee from stereotyping. And I see that there is a kind of specificity for the GCC to face this fourth generation warfare, that it has all the mechanisms and tools of a confrontation, and it has all the tools to build effective strategies and resilient strategies that go hand in hand with the changes of the threats, because this is mainly the basis of threat. Once again, thank you so much for your kind attention, and for the Center and for the UAE for their kind attention and their kind hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I invite His Excellency Mr. Osama Hassan Haikal, Mr. Osama Hassan Haikal, Member of Parliament and former Minister of Information in the Arab Republic of Egypt. In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, first of all, I'd like to thank the ECSSR for inviting me and giving me this chance to attend this important conference. And I think that we've been suffering from the consequences of the fourth generation warfare in the Arab region. I think this is the first conference of its kind in the Arab region to discuss this important matter that we've been talking about for years. The expression fourth generation warfare is an expression which is taken sometimes in a ridiculous way, and sometimes they use some caricature that the word is completely unbearable, and people start to talk about the fifth and sixth and the seventh, in fact. But very recently, the matter has been taken seriously. If we want to sum it up, we can say that fourth generation warfare is that your opponent will force you to defeat yourself by yourself, and you say and you do whatever they want you to do. And here I'm talking about a practical experience. I prepared a paper, but through the discussions today and even yesterday, I tell you that we've been suffering in Egypt from these things during the last few years. They talked about the generations and how about the three previous generations, and they are usually traditional or conventional warfares between two forces or two states, and then the guerrilla war that started in Latin America and that enters even cities, and then the third generation, that is the preemptive war that Hitler used even against his enemies and opponents, and then we witnessed the fourth generation with the development of information technology and technologies. But in fact, I think the first use of the fourth generation started in 1962 during the missiles crisis, when Robert McNamara said after the crisis that there is no space for talking about military strategies, but now we are talking about scenarios of crisis management, and that was the beginning of the crisis management science, but it was in fact the beginning of the thinking of the fourth generation warfare. But the first use or practical use of this term started in 1989 with a strategist who's with Max Manuring while lecturing his students, or to his students, saying that it is a war by force to oblige the opponent to surrender without any need to use regular forces. And during that lecture he said, I quote, that it's a war that targets the opponents slowly and to impose the will upon them. And this is the same objective of conventional wars, and having two armies, one of them is defeated and the other one is victorious. And but the first practical use of this war was discovered through Garrett Cohen, who is who working for Google, and this person was discovered to have been manipulating certain things to topple the regime in Iran and to cause some unrest, but the Iranian intelligence discovered it through their own bureau in Beirut and managed to abort the attempt. And there must have been a kind of a statement on Twitter, and that person postponed that update on Twitter, waiting for certain pressures there in Iran. Was the technological progress had its own effect on the Arab Spring revolutions? No, in fact, and it was used for the first time. I mean, the cyber websites were used in 2001, in fact, to topple the regime that was in the Philippines as Joseph Strata's regime, and people started to protest against him. And at that time, the email was there, and there was no Facebook or WhatsApp at that time, or Twitter or other things, and all these things appeared after 2004. But in 2001, the email was there, so a group of emails were published talking to younger people, less than 35 years old, in 3 words: put on the black shirt on that date, or then and people came to the streets for 3 days, and Joseph Strada's stream fell apart. The same thing was repeated in 2004, in fact, and that was in Spain. There was the Prime Minister Maria Aznar, I think you remember such a name, of course, and there was some economic crisis in Spain, and through the use of emails that the Prime Minister was also removed. And so it was the first time that had been used, I mean, the emails and the cyber environment was used to topple regimes, and that was an evidence of the use of the fourth generation warfare, or a kind of synchronization with the idea of the development of the ICT. Thereafter, the President Barack Obama said at the very beginning of his term that we are witnessing the end of a decade of wars, and we thought that he was a man of peace, a pacifist person, and he came to end wars in the Middle East, and that the United States of America will open a new page with the world. But then we discovered thereafter that he himself did not want the US Army to be involved in a new warfare, but he meant the subjugation of nations without the use of or the employment of arms or traditional warfare. When the Hosni Mubarak's regime was toppled, Obama said on the 4th of March 2011 that the uprisings in the Arab region must serve the policies of the United States. And in the same statement he said that the forces that toppled Mubarak should cooperate with the United States and Israel. That is fixed in and recorded in his statement on that day. And this clearly shows, and in short, that with the use of my mind and planning and money, I will force you to do and perform the policies that I want you to perform? Do such a kind of wars serve and be working with all countries? And the answer is not, in fact, because we have to, in order to make a success of the fourth generation warfare, there must be some pillars available in the target country. For example, there must be a kind of corruption, there must be a kind of recession, unemployment, deterioration of standards of living, high levels of poverty, low levels of education, ignorance, and also the failure of the honesty of elections. All these factors, or some of them or more than them, may create a kind of congestion in the target community or society, and therefore they are controllable through the spread of seditions and upheavals. And this will also show that, and through the tendency towards ethnic problems or even sectarian disputes. So what are the tools used in this field? The tools are very diversified, including the media and social networks, and what is called the NGOs that are funded by external forces. And the major rule is that any NGO that is funded by the external forces will work for the purposes of other things. But for the NGOs that work from inside, once they are paid, they should follow the directives of their own employers, in fact. And this new warfare aims at disturbing the self-confidence of the communities. And we all remember Condoleezza Rice's statement, the former Secretary of State and Advisor of National Security, which is when she referred to the idea of creative chaos, or did not pay attention to the it is creative for them, not for the target nations, causing a huge chaos in these nations. And in fact, I cannot say at all that the technological progress and advancement as it was created in the advanced nations, leading the fourth generation warfare. I did not say that it was created to have an effect on these warfares, but it created a milieu or an environment so that you can affect nations hugely, especially the nations in the Middle East and the Arab world, where we use technology insufficiently. And because technology has its effects and side effects, sometimes it is used as useful, and we are using it in a devastating way and in a much larger way. And before that, before the presence of such ICT channels, for example, it was possible to control media at that time in order to show something. For example, from the UAE, for example, you have a transmission within your own country, but that broadcasting did not go beyond the borders of the United Arab Emirates. The same thing applies to Egypt or any other country. That was called what was called the traditional media or conventional media. That is local media, and there is a point of a station, a transmitting station, and a receiver at a certain place, and there is a kind of control by the government, and thus the state can control media, but with the satellite channels, with the satellite transmission, so they can spread over 1/3 of the earth, so it would be impossible to control it at all. For example, if you close a certain channel, you'll find it coming on another satellite, and therefore preventing in our own days is impossible, and therefore we have to take this into account if you want to face a new war or the fourth generation warfare. And the other point is that with the presence of or the emergence of the non-conventional channels, for example, the internet and the cyber networks, users started to get separated from the traditional ways, as it happened in Egypt in 2011. Parents usually watch TV serials while their next generation, their children, were leading a revolution on Facebook and Twitter and using their own mobiles, working on that thing. So there was a kind of a separation inside the family itself, and therefore the new generation or the youth generation should be our own target for those using the fourth generation of wars in its own targeting the communities and also the states that are targeted by these wars, and how to deal with them, whether by those who are on the offensive or those who are on the defensive sides. in order to clarify the influence of the media and the new channels, when the radio was presented, it remained 38 years to reach 50 million listeners, and when the TV was introduced, it took 14 years to reach or outreach 50 million viewers. But when the internet emerged, it took it 4 years only to reach 50 million users. And this means that the accessibility and the penetration of such technologies was so fast in its own influence, and therefore these channels or these non-conventional media are not subject to any laws in any means. So you can say that, you can say whatever you like, and suppose that person was inside the UAE, for example, and just to give an example, and I managed to reach that person who, for example, spread a rumor from the UAE. I managed to capture, which is very not possible. And that person who spreads rumors, how about those who live outside your country? How can you arrest them? And therefore controlling these networks is almost impossible. And at the same time, the users of these networks and these channels are increasing. The number is increasing. About 3 billion people, almost half of the population of the planet, are using this type of channels and media. And as such, it creates a proper environment or media in collaboration with other factors constituting the fourth generation warfare. And of course, we can add the NGOs and civil society and the intervention of flagrant intervention in the internal affairs of the states in a flagrant way. And when you try to stand this, many countries stand against you because you are against freedom. No, the matter is not like that at all, because in order to face the such a kind of warfare, you must have freedoms, and these freedoms should be responsible, not the freedoms imposed upon you from outside in a clear way. For example, just for example, in Egypt, there was a Freedom House organization, an international organization, working to watch the former Soviet Union policies and talked about freedoms in Egypt for years and years, but they closed their eyes to the policies in Guantanamo. And therefore, since you are working on a selective basis, it means that you target something and you have a political objective in a certain country that you are focusing on. But when you ignore something similar in another country, and in a country that says that it's the leader of freedom in the world, this matter requires examination and requires accuracy, and to have a level of awareness in dealing with this crisis or with this problem. This organization funded a famous group which is called the 6th of April movement in Egypt, and that movement had a consultancy bureau to receive their money and trained a large number of Egyptian young people from 2006 to 2010, and they were almost the movers of things. They were trained on how to use the internet and how to topple the regime and how to do many things. I'm giving you examples from Egypt only to know the effect of the warfare or the fourth generation warfare. The same thing applies to another story. In Egypt, there was another group or other groups, American groups, organizations working in the same approach despite the nose of the state in Egypt. Why? Because there was a kind of balances. There are some relations that impose themselves in Egypt. And I give you, for example, the American or the Republican Institute and the Democratic Institute, who started their work in 2003 in Egypt, and 2006 the Ahmed Abul-Ghait, who is now the Secretary, who is going to be the Secretary General of the Arab League, who ordered to close the American Institute, and President Mubarak said there was no need to make some problems with the United States at that time, and these two institutes were working without any license. That was a big mistake, to allow foreign organizations to work on your own national territories without a license or permit, because the sovereignty here should be respected, of course. Among these organizations were German, US, and other foreign organizations working in Egypt, and And these organizations targeted the countries from inside, talking about security, talking about the use of excessive force, as they used to talk about Egypt, and also they take a certain sector and say that this sector is now more advantaged against the other, in order to instigate young people and talk about the minorities. Sometimes there are some problems between Muslims and Christians, and that was not there before the emergence of such organizations in our country, but these organizations contributed to raise this state of sedition in the recent years in Egypt. However, these organizations managed to create some upheavals and some disorders in the recent years, and caused a kind of congestion that was exploited by media. And also they used even the traditional media, because those people were seen as stars of society, people who are defending human rights, or we used to call them activists, and we don't know what does it mean, how, from where does he bring his money, how does he live, but these organizations used to fund them and to give them their own salaries. And therefore what happened in Egypt over the last 6 years, a kind of tension, and thank God that Egypt got out of the situation, but at least it's now stable and a sovereign state and has its own institutions and managed to survive, because it is different in its own social fabric. But there are other countries that fell into this trap, such as some Arab countries that preceded us in this trap. Also, there are also some other nations in Central Asia that were the states of the former Soviet Union, for example, Georgia and the Ukraine and others. And therefore, we are now facing a new system that is being formed in the world, and among the features of the system is the use of the techniques of the fourth generation warfare. The civil society organizations funded by external forces, as per the confession of the US ambassador to Egypt, and she said that the United States spent $150 million in the summer of 2011 on these organizations, whether registered or non-registered organizations. And therefore, in order to sum up the fourth generation warfare, that there must be a kind of a suitable circumstances in order to create some upheavals, and to use the media and the contemporary channels of social media and networks in order to exploit this milieu or this environment, and that a number of organizations enter to raise this dust and to distract the attention of the government to fight terror, and thus you may cause the fall of the institutions, and thus the Egyptian police disintegrated, and thus you take the armed forces within the framework, and therefore you'll be not engaged in defending your own national borders. And I don't have more time, and if you have any questions, I'll be ready to respond. Thank you.
نفتح الباب الآن للنقاش إذا في حد عنده.
We shall open the floor for further discussion. If you have a question. Dr. Riyad Yassin, former Yemeni foreign minister. I would like to salute Major General Hisham and Major General Ahmad and His Excellency Haykal. What all you've mentioned applies at what happened in Yemen lately, whether when it comes to the emergence of what did the Houthis and the situation that we are here today. Those who follow up on the developments in Yemen certainly the importance of this conference. First of all, we have the coming wars in the Arab region. It's clear that it starts with the militias that hold a certain mentality and intellect. It thinks that it has all the truth, and it is taking advantage of the lack of the presence of the national army. And this is what the UAE is known for and privileged for, as well as Egypt. The presence of this army that can be a primal confrontational force defending the demise of the country. Some of the countries that were destroyed, I mean, did not have this element that could have protected their country. I think it is important through this conference the manner in which we can cooperate to find the alliances that started after this alliance that was able to defend Yemen, and then the Islamic alliance against terrorism. And now we are here to know that the Arab and Islamic alliances that were able to find true results in a very short time frame, regardless of the formal alliances led by the Western countries, that used to see that its interest is limited in the manner in which it can really protect its alliances. But the Arabic alliance really in Yemen or against terrorism, these alliances, of course, have to be built upon according to certain strategies where we all can work together. Thank you. Thank you. We support you. It seems that it is true that the West is West and the East is East. I think that I've really come from heaven to earth, because the issue of the crisis that we are living in, we understand them more than others, more than anyone. We have direct contact with these devilish forces since its inception in Egypt till today. And we hear definitely a number of interpretations and analysis coming from the West. It's very strange if they were true allies and mobilizing themselves to fight this terrorism. A coordination should be directly with us. They should listen to us and know how we plan to really get rid of this scourge. Second, I want to ask you, what makes these pockets, be successful? They are working or using the media outlets really to mobilize their own identity, and they create all this schism. It seems that we haven't understood as well. We are in need today that these forces should be brought together, and the alliances now are expanded all over the Islamic world. As such, in this framework, I think that we should try to put certain plans, true strategies, where we can really conquer our enemy on the ground, and really also on this podium where you are talking. In reality, this is great, respectful saying. No one is, ranking first in the media as the US. Media needs intellect, technology, and money, and they have the three. Sometimes we have two, sometimes we have only money, sometimes we have none, so we depend on intellect, but confrontation is needed. I cannot really succeed as you say, but at least I can lessen the impact. I have so many things where we can use to preserve the Arab national security and the national security of every country, and these things, and you are talking according to your own awareness, so this is important. The strategy that was spoken about by Major General Hisham. He said the solution and then the problem, but what I think that the strategy should be enough all over the countries, every country in itself. Some countries aren't targeted, and there are so many countries in the region that are being targeted that are in need of some of the smart solutions to depend on some of our brothers. The Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, know how to work as such. They have electronic means and electronic really factions that work hard and accurately on these tools. Thank you. I would like to clarify a certain point. What we see of implementation of the fourth generation warfare is an implementation of strategies that were adopted and being implemented in the region. And therefore, so that we are really loyal. All of our really actions in this issue are reactions. Perhaps we might be delayed or anything, but this is a reaction. So we should analyze all what is coming to us from now, and to know what are the threats, what is the strategy to reach the best solution ever, which is to confront the strategy before being implemented on the ground. What is known the confrontation of the strategy of the enemy. This is a very important point, and this will only happen through research centers and intellectual centers that will have any communication with the decision-making countries. This is important. Centers for decision-making, these centers should be specialized and discuss deeply these issues so that we can move to confronting the strategy of the enemy before it is being implemented on the ground. Thank you. In the name of God Almighty, I would like to salute everyone. I appreciate, the time constraints, but I would like to tell the Major Gen Halabi, in the educational sector, I might be wrong, the diversification of the kind of education. I'm talking about Egypt. I hope that this style wouldn't be implemented otherwise. The diversification of the kinds of education, which started a while ago. Do you agree with me that it was one of the holes that or the gaps that the planners of the fourth generation warfare might use to hit the constants and the values of the society, especially with what we've seen of the reluctance of the country or the government and those really overseeing education for having a good education and the lack of certain activities that might have been a mean of funding and financing. I know that time doesn't really help us to talk about all this, but am I right or not? The answer is yes. Will you be able to give a strategic vision to get rid of this gap? Thank you. Thank you. You are right, completely right. Education is the security for every country. But let me really participate in the solution. I participated with a number of university students. The students told us, why haven't you told us about this? Why haven't you really told us? And the fourth generation warfare, the main objective is the civil sector in the targeted country, and therefore the points of interference from within the armed forces in the first three generations to turn into the civil society families, and those targeted are the young because they do not realize the change of the nature of the war, and it's very easy to affect them. This is a very dangerous point in the fourth generation warfare. Second, we are not living on the margins of the world where the threats are less. We are living within the world, and the threats change according or with time. Shouldn't we have a certain article, whatever its name is, to say that what is the nature of the threat coming and how can I interfere as a civil sector? And if I am to interfere, how can I confront? And the minimum, definitely, the minimum of the national security, the maximum, there's nothing maximum in education. Education should be very high because it's the safety and security and thank you. In the name of God, I would like to express my thanks and gratitude for the ECSSR for bringing this elite of speakers. My brother Hisham Al-Halabi, we are graduates of the same school, and thank you, this is an honor. But he has spoken more than one lecture. I would like to praise that, definitely. But since we are military men, we know the external and internal security. But we haven't really spoken about the media outlets, which is for the current generation, the first generation. We haven't really spoken about the moderate religious speech, which they have taken advantage of the first generation warfare to really infiltrate from outside or inside. I would like to praise you once again. Thank you. You are talking right, 100%. In reality, we are doing more than the West wants. We have 1,400 channels in the Arab world. Instead of being an addition to the national economy, it's now contradictory because they wage these conflicts. We only talk about Iraq. They have 380, almost 400 channels, half of them Sunni, half of them Shiite, and they smear each other. We cannot really solve this in the framework of this media channels. No media can work without a methodology. This is what we're talking about. There is accountability, definitely, even within the US and Britain, the mother of democracy, and the accountability. You cannot say whatever you want, even if it is wrong. He should be held accountable. There's no profession without being held accountable. Yes, everything should be studied thoroughly, or else we'll drown. Thank you very much. Sometimes to really talk about the solutions of fourth generation warfare makes us worry and preoccupied. But this depends on the strategy of confrontation from within. We are the within. And therefore, in my opinion, first of all, we have the awareness that the points of interference from within the civil society and the professional awareness, this is the main thing. Psychological operations that target the civilians that don't understand it completely and don't have the mechanism to answer it. Awareness should be in a professional manner. The truth has reached a really high level because it has mastered the issues that it is talking to. The truth should be more proficient, the right and wrong, and the culture of being different through training. I will not forget an example that I've seen in an American school. In the US, the teacher has given the students a controversial subject, yes, according to their own age. Primary, and when they were in conflict, she is trying to control the level of the sound and the terminology. So I noticed that the respect of the other is done through training and then slogans. If it's an issue of slogans, we would have done it, but to be trained to manage the conflict in all ages of education and levels of education. This should be a scientific manner, not a political manner, if it's not convenient to talk about political issues.
أي سؤال؟
Any other question? Therefore, please go ahead. Thank you very much indeed for this session. My question to Mr. Osama Haykal. Today, we are facing a new challenge. The international NGOs are not all politicized. They have a humanitarian role to play, in fact, and I'm sure that you meant those NGOs that work according to a certain political agenda. But, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood organization works on a strategy which is larger than the politicized NGOs, that is the what is called the Munasara or support organizations. So they have a network, a multiple network connected with parliaments in Europe, with a network of activists and financiers, and thus it would be very difficult to discover the means of financing propaganda, rumors, and so where is our own media in facing such a kind of plans that took a globalized perspective rather than a regional perspective? Thank you. I have always been saying that the Arab media is local. Always it addresses us and those who work outside. They work for the Muslim brothers, in fact. So we are in a war in which we have to be more conscious and more, and we should have a kind of a scientific approach. Whatever you say is right. And what I mean is the externally financed NGOs causing a kind of suspicion, or even sometimes you are certain that they work according to the desires and the agendas of the pair. And of course, we have legitimate and controlled NGOs, and their own funds are controllable and audited. And let me say also that there are some of the NGOs that were closed after 2011, went out of Egypt, and they are attracting young Egyptians and Arabs in order to play the same role. The cost is higher, but they do have their own influence, and therefore we have to be conscious, we have to be aware that we have to give more awareness in our own media channels, and we have to persuade people. And even while we are talking now to the foreign and international guests, we have to persuade them. We should have enlightened intellectuals who lead their own communities, and not to fall back there and to see what societies need. So we have to put our own needs in a strategic framework, in fact. And whatever I say is that the application may take some effort, and we have to persuade others, and this is not an easy job, is it? We still have 10 minutes if you'd like to ask or comment. Please go ahead. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Peace. In fact, the subject of that was raised regarding the revealing of the truth, which is very clear to the community, may be very effective in reducing or preventing these sectarian communities or these groups from reaching their targets. And in Egypt, for example, I've been following the features. I cannot see you. Where are you? Can you stand up just to see you? Yeah. For example, if you follow the news channels and the analysis, you find that these analyses lack the truth, lack the revealing of the truth to the ordinary layman, and because they think that those people are not important, because in fact these channels feed these groups and these organizations, and sometimes from a TV channel you see a kind of investigation in a certain problem, and then some forces enter intervene, and therefore the people and the public opinion is not following what's going on. And whether it was an accident, for example, the news is given just like that, and then the media would run to another accident. But in some programs, for example, you find that one of the things that helped the government of Egypt, for example, to control the situation up to this moment were through these channels and through these analysts. Thank you. I hope that I understood you, but I don't know that there are certain forces intervened in a certain program. I don't know. I don't know. I am not aware of that thing, but this is a kind of guessing. I don't say that guessing is a sin, as we the Arabs say, and some of the programs are also sinful. For example, if I take the sectarian sedition in Egypt, am I going to sort it out in a program on TV, and then while I'm suffering there, I try to sort it out, and this takes, of course, and requires treatment of fundamentalism from this side or the other side, and therefore I cannot raise a certain subject in a very hot moment, and I might not reach a solution. I might reach another problem, in fact, and therefore on TV channels you find that, or in even some institutions, they have the study centers and research centers, and they may raise the question, are we going to raise this subject or not? Are we going to deal with it? How to deal with it? What is the best approach to bring the speakers or the interviewees? And most of the programs on TV channels, usually the announcer gives his own opinion as they like, and this is a kind of a chaos, in fact, and causing a problem. Yes, I think you see it on TVs in Egypt, and of course there are no political borders among nations nowadays, and therefore this requires a kind of organization, because restriction is not possible at all, and you cannot prevent or close a channel in any place in the world, and they may move to another. Even the Muslim brothers have their own channels out of Egypt, and they are from a certain satellite, and the fighting is there in the outer space and not on the earth here, so they can go up there, and thus you should have a strategy for media, and you should know where are you going. And our media in the Arab world is still in a state of generalization. They are not specialized. There is no targeted group, and you don't know who do you address. And they say, for example, I'm going to address the Arab community. Which category? The young, the elderly, the women, men, or the girls, or who? Or the other, how about the religious and the clergymen's channels and other things? So we need to have that, because no Arab country is accepted from these warfares, and because we have certain norms and traditions, and we have common traditions, and that the majority of Arabs are from the same religious background. They have almost the same norms and the same language, and thus the media will have a magical influence. And part of this warfare is that you cannot go out of the Arab world, because when there is an international channel talking or addressing the Arab world, it addresses 300 million people in one language. But if you want to address your channel to Western Europe, in which language? English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, or which language? Or Italian? So you have difficulty in addressing yourself and sending your message to the world, but you have to take measures. Thank you. Just one point. The strategic subjects are not easy to study, because there is always a political element, a military element, social element, technical element, and therefore there are some gray areas in these regions, and they need specialists, and the terms and the glossary is very difficult, and therefore they need to be clarified, to be simplified on these networks, and I think that will cause a kind of a problem in selection. So I have a suggestion here. here. Do the research centers or do they issue, for example, some papers and some research papers in a simplified language that addresses all categories, or to send some people to talk on TV shows, for example, because the scientific approach is the foundation or the pillar, but sometimes it might be a barrier using a certain jargon that is incomprehensible by the public, and it might have negative consequences, and there's a problem and we may have some recommendations on this point also. Thank you. Despite the danger and the risk of such a kind of a war, confrontation is not impossible, and the nationals of the targeted countries are the constituents of the implementation of the process of the disintegration of their own nations, and therefore they have to be aware of these threats, and they have to comprehend new types of disputes, conflicts, instruments, and nature of this conflict, which is completely different from the former generations. The best approach to confront is to set up a comprehensive strategy that includes the full observance of the new forms of warfare and the professional use of the forces of the nation, and awareness and scientific analysis of the internal, regional, international events through strong and specialized academies and institutions constitute the safety valves of those nations that seek to protect their own existence. And thus we come to the end of the session. I hope it was useful for all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you and the participants in the second session. And thus we come to the end of the first day of our own fourth generation warfare conference. See you tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the morning. Assalamu alaikum.